family and fellow soldiers. I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth.
If you live in the very rural parts of the state and your electricity goes out and it's because of downed trees and power lines, it could be a while before you get power restored.
Roughly 500,000 customers are still without power across the country as utility companies work to clear equipment encased in ice.
The number of fatalities blamed on that monster winter storm that hit much of the country over the weekend is still rising. It's up to at least 34 people in 15 states, including 3 brothers who died after falling through an icy pond in North Texas.
For this morning's briefing, I want to discuss the recent Arctic blast that has frozen most of the United States, but mostly I want to discuss the reaction that some people have had to it. This storm has been a repeat of what happened about 5 years ago when you had that Arctic blast that killed a lot of people in Texas. I think they had something on the order of 250 people who froze to death, and this in their major cities like Dallas and Houston. Now, when that occurred, I couldn't help but think about Hurricane Katrina. And when it was black people primarily who were the main victims of that natural disaster, well, we had people calling them refugees and basically blaming them for Mother Nature. The main thing that we were hearing from the white right was stuff like, well, you people had days of warning, and these people weren't prepared, it's their own doggone fault. And then in the aftermath of that disaster, when the city was completely wrecked, you had a bunch of people from the white right who were saying, well, the citizens there, they shouldn't be looking for the federal government to come in and do any disaster relief. Why? They need to be handling things themselves. They need to be go ahead and repairing and cleaning up the city all by themselves. Interesting how we're not hearing all that this time around, the same way we didn't hear it 5 years ago. The main people who are being hurt by this storm are the very people who ran out to the rural areas. That's something that needs to be noted, because these are people who chose to go out into the sticks, and as a result, the utility companies aren't able to get to them very easily. These are the people who, after practically every natural disaster, are usually without utilities for several days, if not weeks. These are the folks who on the news, you find out like weeks after the disaster that these people still haven't gotten power restored and that kind of thing. You're going, man, who in the world has this kind of bad luck? It's the people who ran out there into the middle of nowhere. These are the people who the white right don't talk about. They don't blame them for what Mother Nature does, even though these are the main people who suffer from it. Look what happens in Florida every year. There's not a bunch of black people who are out there getting wiped out every year and then deciding, I'm going to rebuild right here where the disaster happened. Those folks wanted to be away from everyone else, primarily from black people, and that's fine. I have no problem with that whatsoever. Just keep in mind, though, this is what alone looks like. But the part that gets me about the people who choose to do that kind of thing is the rhetoric that they use as they try to glorify themselves simply for where they chose to live. They try to wax poetic about their own phony notions that they're reliving some sort of pioneer era. Yeah, you're about 15 minutes outside of the big city. You're really out there on the frontier, aren't you? And they're talking as if they're relying totally on their own independence. Yeah, because when the Europeans were invading the Americas and such, they had plenty of grocery stores and gas stations within a 15-minute drive that they could go to, right? And predictably, you'll have the bottom feeders of the white right who will play to that delusion because people like that are the quote-unquote salt of the earth. As the white right sees them, a bunch of simpletons, go ahead and give them a pat on the head and tell them how great they are, and they'll be eating out of your hand. LBJ talked about that back in the day. Well, somebody needs to tell these people that they're not bravely taming the boondocks. And what they like to refer to as their own independence is basically their total reliance on a septic tank and a well, and of course they still have to get electricity even out in the middle of the sticks. That's not self-reliance. That's just an alternate source of water and waste elimination. That's what they actually did. Like the rest of you, I've been watching and monitoring as this huge polar storm has swept across the country. When a weather event affects 200 million Americans, it's kind of hard to ignore it. But one of the main things that have interested me about it are the reactions to it. Oh yeah, we knew that there was going to be some color-coded commentary on this one. See, the thing that those people who like to run out to the rural areas need to remember is you can't talk all that self-reliance crap when the power grid goes out in the middle of winter. One thing's for sure, you don't see the people who live in the inner city having to do without electricity for weeks on end after a major weather event. And you certainly don't see any of the residents of the inner city wagging their fingers at the largely white population that lives out in the real America, which is the middle of nowhere apparently. They're not sitting there saying, well, you guys without power and such, you people, you need to stop complaining about what the government isn't doing for you and that there needs to be some sort of government accountability. You chose where you wanted to live. And if your neighbors are freezing to death and if your roads are impassable, well, you guys need to go ahead and get organized and you need to go ahead and take care of that yourselves. You need to have neighbors you can rely on and depend on. You need to come together and stop expecting other people to do everything for you. You know, the exact same kind of shaming language that was used against the black victims of Hurricane Katrina. We're not hearing any of that for this event, the same way that we didn't hear it for any of the other hurricanes that have struck the United States. All of those hurricanes that hit Florida on an annual basis, sometimes multiple hurricanes, and yet nobody feels the need to shame those white retirees down in Ron DeSantis' little gulag. DeSantis made a proper idiot of himself for about the umpteenth time when he was in Congress, talking about how after Hurricane Sandy, New York didn't need to get any disaster relief. Then he made the mistake of becoming governor of Florida, and next thing you know, he's begging for disaster relief every 5 minutes. Just goes to show there's no cure for stupid. But these are the areas of the country, and in most cases, these are the very people who call themselves the real America. And they are. They're frightened. They told themselves lies. They've got a media and a society that repeats these lies to them and tries to glorify them on that basis until they convince themselves that they're just so strong and independent because of the fact that they dug a well or had a company come out and do it for them. And truth be told, especially at this moment, they're a perfect metaphor for the United States. Isolated, frightened, cold, and dying. That's what America is. And just like America, these people who decided that they were going to go out into the middle of nowhere to escape black people in all their forms, these people have drowned in their own delusions, in complete denial about the real source of their survival, contemptuous of the real America who made their prosperity possible in the first place. And once they're cut off from the source, they're hollering, but nobody can hear them. This is what all of the myth-making under white supremacy has brought people to. This is what it makes of them. Born in ignorance, living in delusion, and dying in darkness. That's America. And there's no chance that this is going to lead to a change that could be meaningful because the white media is not going to be giving this any sort of attention, not the kind that would actually ask serious questions about how to truly avoid this in the future. And on top of that, nobody's going to be blaming the victims for their own misfortunes. Because when you look at where the greatest devastation's taken place, the greatest loss of life, and the greatest destruction to the infrastructure, predictably it's in the states of the old Confederacy, the most backward part of a backward nation. You have people who are actually pointing the finger and trying to ridicule the city of Houston when their mayor announced that basically they didn't have any snow plows because, of course, the city being so far south doesn't need them. There were a lot of people who thought that that was just something to point the finger at and it was so hilarious. But as we saw 5 years ago, truth be told, even at its worst, Houston still sustained less casualties than, say, Dallas. And Houston is America's fourth largest city. If these guys are in any sort of real trouble, you better believe there's going to be a number of utility companies and a bunch of contractors and even the state government, even though they may hate it, who are going to have to respond regardless. That's what happens when you have a large population center like that. You want to know why it is that Houston isn't stockpiling snow plows? It's because they don't need to do it themselves. They can easily get others to do it for them. That's another big benefit of having such a huge metropolitan city. There's always people who, if they think that there's a government contract in it for them, who will gladly come along and try to solve your problem for you for a fee, of course. It's not the people of Houston who are going to be spending the next few days, if not weeks, trying to figure out whether or not the lights are going to come back on. It's not the people of Houston who are going to be seeing major infrastructure damage that won't be repaired for months, if not years. Their bridges and roads are going to be made passable almost instantaneously because they got the resources for it. The people who called themselves trying to point the dirty end of the stick at Houston and saying, oh, look at these guys, isn't this ridiculous? They ought to be saving their ridicule, if not their sympathy, for the other people who you don't see on the cameras. The ones who are going to be up a frozen creek without a paddle. Those are the people who the headlines need to be about. Those are the people who these bigoted commentators need to be saving their actual energy for. But of course, they're not. They don't actually care about these people. They don't care about loss of life. All they care about is getting a temporary sugar rush from being able to cast aspersions on people who are their betters. That's their primary preoccupation. And while there's not going to be any consequences or penalties that accrue to this behavior, the reality is there doesn't have to be. White supremacy is a suicide cult. Its survival is not at the top of its list of priorities. Its domination and power are, and it has no problem going ahead and feeding a few of its own to the wolves if they think it's going to maintain their power, and the main thing that they like about it is being able to do things that others can't. When other people, like black people, make a mistake, we have to accept it, look at ourselves, and make some changes. We have to take some responsibility, accountability, and some blame. White supremacy is about the opposite of that. It's about getting all of these things given to you regardless, and there is no accountability because there's never any consequences. There's no need to admit that you were wrong because nobody has the ability to punish you for it. And if you do happen to run into a rough patch, you can always take resources from other people. And after all, white supremacy means never having to say you're sorry. But in light of this major weather event that's been sweeping the country since this weekend, I thought that this is something that needed to be said. Anytime there's a natural disaster, let's make sure we remind people who the victims are, the real ones. The ones who the white media keeps out of sight and out of mind. And that being the case, they're the ones who suffer because of this. The white media is trying to save face and could care less about saving lives. If people call themselves wanting to live out in the middle of nowhere, for whatever reason, I don't fault them for that. That's fine. But when people take on a certain subculture of having a snooty, superior attitude simply because they don't live in the city, that's when I look and ask, well, gee, how smart an idea was this, really? Because the truth of the matter happens to be when you have larger concentrations of people, that's when you actually have larger concentrations of help.
As crews work around the clock to get the lights and heat back on, local chefs like Daniel Yarzagay are cooking up hundreds of hot meals for those who've gone days without.
It was both heartbreaking and very rewarding because some of these people were literally crying as you handed them hot food because they haven't eaten in 2 days.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Today, another 400 meals hand-delivered to parts of the city hit hardest.
There are plenty of criticisms that could be made about city life and urban living in general, and a lot of them are otherwise legitimate. But we can make just as many, if not more, criticisms about rural life. And there is one thing that we know for certain. If you don't have people around you who are ready to help, if you don't have access to the actual centers of industry and government that can respond quickly when you're in trouble, well, if that's where you've chosen to be, when disaster strikes, it's going to be a cold day in hell. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Amir Miller, Dean Brooks, Tyrone Leak, Onan X, and Wali Bilal. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.